morning, Renu. Sunday morning podcasting.
I can't believe you dragged me in. It's sleep-in time on Sunday morning.
She doesn't usually get out of bed early on Sunday morning for a podcast, that's for sure.
But it's worth it today.
Yep. Great. So this is backed by popular demand. We're revisiting this topic. So
How long has it been since we did this?
I'll tell you, I looked it all up yesterday, December 2022. We posted a podcast called Why We Should Rename Gleason 6 Prostate Cancer, brackets, and Why We Can't. Right? Yeah. And it turned out to be a really, really big popular episode. As of yesterday, there were like 17,000 views on YouTube alone and tens of thousands more on audio, more than 70 comments on YouTube, and I've gone through them all, and we reply to almost all these comments. We have done over the years as well.
Lots of patients,
urologists
telling us their stories.
Yep. And then a month ago there was this one from Bella33 saying, just wondering if there's been any success in the declassification of Gleason 6 to non-cancer or any updated positive progression. I note there was a conference planned 12 months after this podcast, which would have happened in 2023, I imagine. So when I saw that comment coming in a month ago, I texted you and you said, well, let's get the two of the guests of that podcast back on. So that's exactly what we've done.
See what's happened in 3 years.
Let's go to the US and welcome old friends of the podcast, Matt Cooperberg, urologist at UCSF in San Francisco. Hey, Matt. And Scott Eggener, urologist at the University of Chicago, although soon to be moving. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
Welcome,
Great
gents.
to have the boys back.
Thanks for getting up early to talk with us.
We did have Eva Comperat last time as well, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. So look, that's my fault. We couldn't get a European with this time zone, but we did intend having a GU pathologist because Eva Comperat joined us the last time, and it was really, really good to have her perspective as a super experienced GU pathologist who's very involved in clinical matters. But I just didn't get organised in time to.
That's okay. We have a paper to discuss instead.
We have, but would we have got a pathologist on a Sunday morning in Australia or a Saturday evening in the US? Oh, probably. Is that easy to do? I don't normally speak to them on either of those.
Do you normally do frozen sections on a Sunday morning?
Anyway, I know lots of pathologists listen to us, so we are going to barrel into this topic without your expertise, GU pathology friends, but we might remedy that with a follow up.
Yeah.
So gents, welcome. And Scott, first of all, we'll go to you because we've just heard before we hit record on this podcast that you're actually moving after all these years from Chicago. So congratulations, incoming chair of urology at UCLA in Los Angeles. Yeah,
huge news. Congrats.
Yeah, thanks. I'm super excited to be starting in about a month or so. And this will be one of the topics and, continue some of the work that I've done with Matt and many others. But, a big change and looking forward to it.
That's brilliant. We were just complaining about the cold winters and now you're going to move to sunny California and it'll be much nicer. So that's huge.
Yeah, congratulations, Matt. I'm sure you're happy to have him down the coast as well. A good friend and collaborator of yours for all those years. Yeah, it's great. It's great to
absolutely.
Yeah. So
and in the University of California, no less. So
yeah, University of California. Yeah, joining an already very good team at that particular site, but powerhouse.
Lots of potential
of great urology over in the West Coast. So yeah, Renu, what should we do? Maybe shall I read out a few of these comments and for those who didn't listen to the previous podcast, we might go and do what we did the first time around, which was ask Scott to just give us a bit about the backdrop to this discussion about Gleason 6 or grade group 1 prostate cancer, why perhaps it should not be called cancer at all. That's the whole running thing of this. But just to read out a few of the comments from a few people. Here we go. Rob says, as a 63-year-old who's just received a report with a single finding of grade group 1 cancer, 0.5 millimeters, I'm feeling like a wimpy cancer poster boy, which is because Scott said he describes this as a wimpy cancer to his patients.
The wimpiest type of cancer.
I can't describe how helpful it is to have listened to your discussion. I'm meeting in a couple of days with my urologist and we'll listen to what he has to say. So that's a patient who found it helpful. Here's another one. Derek says, at present, the problem is that only biopsies determine the grade of cancer, but biopsy sampling is somewhat of a finding a needle in a haystack exercise. I speak from personal experience. And I remember replying to Derek's message saying, MRI does address some of that. He hadn't had an MRI, as it turns out. Christian, I agree that in that men in grade group 1 should be minimally informed without using the word cancer to the extent of not worrying them. He's agreeing with that because it does cause mental stress. However, we should still be promoting PSA testing, MRI scanning, and so on. And it goes on, and a few people, Renu, made the point that you made on the last podcast that word cancer, patients often stop listening, it's cancer, etc. There can be all sorts of emotional impact. things with insurance, work, etc., etc. So, there's a whole thing that goes with the word cancer, which again is what drives the discussion around, do we even need to call it cancer and so on. Here's a urologist, David Boucher-Hayes, great friend of the podcast from Ireland, who did say, I think this discussion demonstrates a failure on behalf of urologists in not explaining this condition better and not absolutely insisting on active surveillance and tailoring it for the specific patient. So Scott, take us back to, why this campaign of trying to drop the label cancer from grade 1, Gleason 6 prostate cancer, has been a big passion of yours for many, many years now.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really salient points on kind of both sides of the equation to a degree. To really simplify it, the hypothesis of our group and many other people who spend time in this space is that public health would dramatically improve if there was some type of precancerous label in lieu of grade group 1 or Gleason 6. And there would be a net benefit. And there's a ton of, potential reasons that we think are really striking and powerful and set the table to have the discussion and make it happen. And you alluded to some of them. There's certainly the emotional, suicide rates, strangely, but not surprisingly, go up after a, relatively indolent diagnosis. In many parts of the world, there's dramatic rates of unnecessary diagnosis and unnecessary treatment with shorter lifelong side effects that go with it, let alone kind of the, self-identity of having a cancer diagnosed and a whole slew of other things that go along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you raised an important point here. We're not saying it's normal; it's a precancerous condition. So that still has the implication that this needs close follow-up and monitoring. And I think that's the key thing not to miss in this discussion.
And Matt, after our last podcast, there was a conference coming up that you hosted at UCSF, coinciding with the ASCO GU meeting just a few months after this podcast.
So we were both there.
And we were there. It was great. And a very nice paper came out of that, and you had a really broad group of people, including pathologists, imaging experts, patients involved in this. So can you tell us a bit about that conference and about the paper that came out of it? Because that then did keep this momentum going. And actually that paper got kind of global headlines, and Renu was commenting in the national media here about it as well. But take us back to that conference and that paper.
Yeah, absolutely. ASCO GU was kind of a good excuse to get everyone together since many people were in San Francisco in person already. We ultimately had 50 experts from, I think we had 5 continents represented, and multiple specialties. So we had urology, pathology, medical and radiation oncologists. We had patient advocates, and we also had speakers come and join us from the world of thyroid cancer and breast cancer, where there have been really interesting parallel conversations and victory in the case of thyroid cancer in terms of declassifying a certain subset of thyroid cancers as cancer. And it's really important to stress the goal of this symposium was not to get a consensus about declassifying grade group 1, but rather to establish a framework to continue the conversation. And to that end, we explicitly invited folks who were on the con side of the debate, to really establish the terms of engagement, if you will. It was really a way to kind of formalize the discussion because, as you said, this has been going on for a number of years now. 2008, Laura Esterman in the breast oncology world wrote an editorial in JAMA with Ian Thompson arguing for declassification. There was even a paper earlier than that by Ollie Sarter in 2006. But I think now there's really a lot more momentum, and the discussion is getting more serious. And the symposium was a really good excuse to really get this multidisciplinary lens on what the challenges are. The entire thing is posted, by the way, on the Euro Today website. And one of the best aspects of this was the full half day that folks took out of their schedules during ASCO or just before ASCO GU. And some of the best content, I think, is the back and forth discussion that we had between these really short, rapid fire, 3-minute talks by these international experts. So, the 1,000 words in JNCI was great, but there's an incredible discussion that we do have on video, and anyone watching this that wants to see more can find this on Euro Today.
Fantastic.
And we'll put a link in the show notes to that as well. And but I remember at that meeting, Matt, and And there were, it was a really positive environment. And hearing from people in thyroid cancer talking about how they had reclassified from cancer to not cancer. I can't remember that really early grade thyroid cancer. But at the end of the day, when we were going around the room, I recall like one of the really passionate pathologists who'd been there all day, who'd been very pro it, was asked that question. Well, do you think that the WHO or the ISUP committee will consider this favorably and will regrade it? He said, no chance, or words to that effect. They said, look, it won't happen because there are morphological, anatomical reasons why this will always be described as a cancer, and therefore it'll come back to us clinicians to just better describe indolent conditions or low risk, a condition and reassure the patient, but they won't be able to change the fact of it. I don't know. Do you, or maybe that? Actually, let's go to Scott first and ask that question. What's your reaction to that? Because urologists can't rename this as cancer. It has to be pathologists who rename the condition.
There's a whole bunch of critical partners in this, and pathologists are certainly one of them. Anyone that sees a patient with prostate cancer, and perhaps most important, are patients with prostate cancer or those destined to be diagnosed with it in the future. And the great news, and for those of us that think this is an important topic, I can speak for many of us that we're overjoyed that many of these groups have, kind of taken the mantle and run with it, including the pathologists. They've gotten together and had discussions kind of in parallel, if not touching on this topic. There are multiple patient stakeholder groups that have taken it, and run with it and forced the conversation. There's grants that people, including Matt and others, have trying to address this. There's been surveys of patients and clinicians. And so hopefully there's a critical mass to at least force the conversation. The House of Medicine isn't known for swift change, but I do think there's, positive news that at least the conversation is happening.
And Matt, how far do you think we've come in these years? What's changed? If you look back to 2022, or when you had your conference at UCSF, can you give us some perspective on how far we've come and what's changed?
Yeah, I mean, like Scott just said, nothing moves quickly in medicine, but I think the breadth of engagement and the seriousness of engagement around the question is slowly gathering weight and momentum. And that's really important and really, really encouraging. There was a white paper that just came out from the two prominent international GU pathology societies, a white paper talking about indolent prostate cancer, not talking about changing nomenclature specifically, but at least talking about what indolent prostate cancer means and how we should think about it from a multidisciplinary perspective. And I would really emphasize that aspect of this conversation. One of the really interesting conversations we've had, Rob Reiter actually introduced Scott and me to a linguistics professor at UCLA, soon to be a colleague of Scott's, named Jessica Rett, who's been taking on this question from the language standpoint. And it's honestly, if anything, I think, given us even more of a philosophical perspective on this whole thing. Because if you think about it, we obviously agree completely with David and others that urologists need to be doing active surveillance more consistently for lower grade disease. But I think there's also a little bit of an unfair expectation that the urologists can completely dispel the word and the implication of the cancer diagnosis by talking about active surveillance, by talking about this being a wimpy cancer, what have you. Because the reality is that word, cancer, the karkinos, this goes back 3,000 years to Hippocrates, literally. And it's got this exceptionally deep resonance in the culture based on a clinical diagnosis. For literally thousands of years, cancer was a diagnosis that killed you, period. Right? For, 150 years, we've been taking things out and sending them to the pathologists, and they look under the microscope and they now classify it based on how it looks after we took out a visible or symptomatic tumor. It's only in the last couple of decades that we've been screening for cancer, sending little bits of tissue to pathologists who say, well, this looks just like the thing you took out a few years ago that would have killed the guy. So we've, sort of non-intentionally affected this sea change of how we diagnose prostate cancer. And it's kind of de facto that the pathologists have come to own the diagnosis, but it's not like that was a concerted discussion across different branches of medicine. It just sort of evolved. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect of this is, of course, that we're understanding the molecular basis much more profoundly than we used to. And we know there is a continuum, right? You go from normal tissue to tissue that has histologic molecular changes. We can find PTEN deletion and MYC amplification in tissue that looks normal under the microscope. Then we see grade group 1, which actually doesn't look that different molecularly from the altered histologically normal stuff next door. And then you get more alterations and you get higher grade cancer. So we have to acknowledge that the line we draw in the sand when the cells start to look funny under the microscope is an arbitrary line in a continuous molecular evolution. And there is no particular reason that we could not shift that line one step to the right. We've done it this way for 150 years based on microscopy because that was, a revolutionary technology. But we're in the midst of a new revolution in molecular medicine, and we should reflect our new understanding of what is really happening at the fundamental biological level in the way we talk to patients, the way we think about these diagnoses, not just in prostate. Prostate is, I think, kind of exhibit A because of the public health implications, but there's many other tumors that, there's similar conversations ongoing, or could be.
Yeah, it's interesting,
I would
isn't it?
add one thing to that terrific overview of, I will say it in this forum as I have in many others around the world, I'm not aware of a single man in human history who has died from modernly, contemporarily graded grade group 1. And so until that's, proven otherwise, and I'll be happy to change my mind, but you try to marry that with what Matt mentioned about the linguistics. What does cancer mean? Cancer, literally, the definition is something that can grow and spread and kill you. And that's how most people in a population interpret it. So those two are just discordant with each other. So on a very basic level, I think we need to address that.
And it's important, isn't it? Because Declan, even though most urologists will be advocating for active surveillance in grade group 1 disease, there are still going to be urologists that will get nervous by volume of grade group 1, and that nervousness is often going to be reflected on their patients as well. So the word does matter.
And here's another comment from the YouTube channel as well from Imran Askari. We need to hear more from patients whose prostate pathology is reported as wimpy cancer, because we referred to that in the previous podcast. There should be greater emphasis on the hardships they may face, such as repeated blood tests, MRI scans, and most importantly, rebiopsies or possibly subsequent treatment. Recently, the American Thyroid Association made their efforts to recruit patients with the Cadillac of cancers and amplified their voices regarding their experiences with DTC. Yeah. So those hardships, if you weigh up what Scott just said about, he's said this many times before, including on the podcast, that he's not aware of a single person with proper grade group 1 who's ever suffered harm from progression, etc. But then you weigh it up against the amount of patients who get diagnosed with low-risk prostate cancer who have the kind of harm that Imran referred to just from biopsies, or like they've had a prostatectomy or radiation and all of the devastating impact that can have as well. So how do you balance it up, Scott? How do people, not just looking down a microscope, but looking more broadly at this situation of low-risk prostate cancer, balance those things up and understand that, the label, the cancer thing is a problem?
Yeah, there's a really long-winded, multifold explanation to it. But to address a couple things, I mean, Renu appropriately mentions that in many countries, most men with grade group 1 do surveillance. In many other countries, almost every man with grade group 1 gets treatment. And I've heard from people that run those registries in those countries. It's not published data, but there's countries that have a large population. And so, and then Declan, you wanted me to comment on what in addition to, I'm sorry,
yeah, how do we, if you put it like that, the polar extreme of, well, look, a proper grade group 1 cancer is not going to progress and meet those definitions of cancer, of spreading and dying. But the diagnosis of low-risk prostate cancer clearly leads to quite a big burden for patients. Even if they don't get treated for the cancer, as this commenter was pointing out, with
repeated tests,
or social impact, as well, work and insurance, let alone they have a prostatectomy or radiation for an unnecessary cancer. Is there a way which you can paint that picture of the impact of low-risk prostate cancer to people who can?
That commenter is spot on, and we would all agree. I mean, routine testing and MRIs and biopsies are no walk in the park. I guess the way to put it in perspective is it sure seems, at least to me and most others, that's way better than undergoing whole gland treatment that may have lifelong implications to quality of life. Now, I think, and many others think, first step is to have this conversation and see what type of changes with nomenclature or other initiatives. But we would all dream of that utopian day where perhaps there's next level technology, and there are things happening, on the scientific level, on the AI level, just integrating data, where maybe we will have enough information about a person's prostate where we can start dialing back even more than we do now on surveillance, and it can be much safer and less invasive.
Renu, that brings us to this paper in European Urology. This is last month. We'll put the link in the show notes. Really nice piece, a platinum opinion, invited into our flagship journal from the GU Pathology Society and the ISUP, the International Society of Urologic Pathology. So a really, really good group of pathologists led by Rajal Shah, a senior author, Glenn Christensen. And they've done a really nice kind of piece-by-piece approach to the title of the paper is Defining Indolent Prostate Cancer, Calls for a Multidisciplinary Approach. So, point by point, how to detect indolent cancer. Can indolent cancer be reliably detected at biopsy and so forth? It's very nice. And you have written a nice reply to this, Matt, Scott, and Jeremy Grummet, our colleague here in Melbourne. So can I ask you, because it strikes me as this does show the expert end of GU pathology are definitely engaging with this, and there's an article in a urology journal, not a pathology journal. Matt, tell us a bit about your reaction to this paper, and you did write a very nice letter, as I said.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I think that the best thing about this, there's many good things about it, but the best thing about it is just the fact of formal engagement by the two international subspecialty societies in pathology. This was not just a commentary by a group of pathologists. This is actually with the byline of the societies. And that's a critical step in the right direction just by fact of engagement. Glad Panera, who's second author on the white paper, is one of the leading advocates, I think, for reconsidering the diagnosis. There's others on the author list as well who were at our symposium, along with Glad. There's others on this list who have been, on the author list who have been, quite vocally opposed to change. So, it's great to see sort of all sides of the conversation being reflected in this white paper. What they said, the point by point. It's kind of interesting because there's a lot of clinical recommendation in here. I mean, I think one of the things that we reacted to in the response letter is something that we've heard quite often from pathologists who have reservations about a nomenclature change, which is that, a biopsy can undersample a prostate cancer. And there's this sense of discomfort with calling something indolent when they might have missed some higher grade cancer. And I think there's a number of responses to that. The most obvious one of which is that you cannot diagnose something based on what you didn't see. You really should only diagnose something based on what you did see. Of course, we all know a negative biopsy can miss a high-grade cancer too, and we don't label those patients with anything other than benign. And the title that this should be multidisciplinary, of course, we all agree with that. We need good imaging, you need good biopsy technique, you need good counseling, et cetera, et cetera. But, in terms of the pathologist's role, of course, is to describe what they are seeing, and I think the part that we talked about at the GU ASCO symposium and did not make it into this white paper is, are we correct in focusing on this loss of the basal cell layer as kind of the sine qua non of cancer? Again, it's that has always been out there as kind of the analogy to a cancer invading the basement membrane, which the prostate doesn't really have. I've never quite been clear that that's really a correct analogy, if in a way. So I think there's a lot of great avenues to continue this conversation. And like I said, the fact of formal engagement, I think, is by far the best news here.
Yeah, I mean that's a really great outcome from all of this.
Matt, I would emphasize one other point too.
Go ahead, please.
No, sorry. I was going to say, let's just emphasize one other thing, because there is comments in here about, what we should be doing to monitor it, et cetera. And I would emphasize, I think it's something both Scott and I said last time around too, is that nobody who is advocating for change in nomenclature here is suggesting that we would monitor these lesions any differently than we do now. And it's an important point to stress over and over again that if we call it something other than cancer, it absolutely needs to be surveilled just like it would be today. We can call it a precancer, we can call it whatever we want. There's a whole discussion over what those options are. But anything that would be precancerous would still need follow-on imaging, confirmatory biopsy, long-term PSA surveillance, et cetera, just like we do surveillance now, because yes, some of them will eventually show up with higher grade disease. I will say that the other really great paper that came out last year in this domain was from Jane Wynn and Jesse McKinney and that group, dichotomizing favorable versus unfavorable histology prostate cancer. And I don't know if you've addressed that in the podcast, but I've been doing biomarker work, as have many others, for 15 years now. I have never seen Kaplan-Meier curves split the way the curves split for patients that do versus do not have this unfavorable histology, which is basically large cribriform, intraductal, or a couple of rarer variants. So those split along with pattern 5 away from pattern 3 and the fused gland, poorly formed gland subtype pattern 3s. And it's a really, really important paper relevant to this discussion because one of the other concerns that the pathologists raise in this white paper and elsewhere is that, well, there's a lot of disagreement among pathologists about what is really 3.3 versus what is 3.4, and what if we undersample, or pathologists going to be more likely to now upgrade things because they're worried about not calling it cancer, et cetera. This unfavorable versus favorable dichotomization paper is really, really critical because pathologists do not mistake 3.3 for large cribriform, right? The distinction and the concern is about the 3.3s versus the cancers that are fused gland subtype pattern 4 with like 5% pattern 4, where, is it a sectioning artifact or is it really gland fusion? Biologically and clinically, it probably doesn't matter that much, and you really want to fast forward this conversation, there's probably a whole set of minor 3.4s that we could also call not cancer. We don't have to talk about that right now, but in terms of biologic capacity to kill a patient, it's probably not that different. So it's another really important piece of the puzzle that I think is falling into place here.
Yeah, I mean, this paper it's a great read. So the white paper does say that the best way to detect indolent cancer is complete examination of the prostate with a radical prostatectomy. And these guys do say that, we respectfully disagree that defining indolence requires a prostatectomy. I mean, if we...
well said.
Which is really well said. And I mean, on the flip side, Declan, now our imaging is becoming so good that we are probably going to enter an era soon where we do prostatectomies without a biopsy.
I did one on Wednesday.
Right.
I said, don't try this.
I've done one.
Literally one of the ones I did on Wednesday, a 52-year-old, strong family history, PIRADS 5, PSMA, AVID, SUV max 12. Oh, yeah, he'd seen 5 urologists and I still recommended a biopsy. And but he definitely did not want a biopsy for his own reasons. And so we did a prostatectomy, but and Andrew Ryan, our pathologist, rang me the next day because I said, Andrew, can please have a good look at this? There's no biopsy to go with it. And grade group 5 prostate cancer T3, right? Yeah. And so I told the patient on Friday, just 2 days ago about that. But I'm saying don't try that at home. But I suppose the opposite might be the case here. What about the double negative imaging? And that's kind of what we do already, isn't it?
This worry about, are we missing something when someone has grade group 1 prostate cancer? Well, with the imaging we have, are we going to miss anything?
We're not totally blind to it.
Yeah.
But Matt, I want to ask you about that. I'll go to you. I'll ask Matt first and then I'll ask Scott. But because on the last podcast, you said that the Aqua Registry at that time, 2022, the AUA Registry was saying about 40% of low-risk prostate cancers in the US were still being offered intervention. And of course, there's all that wild variability around the country. Can you tell us in 2025 roughly, what do you think the treatment rate is for low-risk prostate cancer?
I would love to give an update from Aqua, but the registry is actually going through a major reorganization and a new software vendor and all that. So we don't have a data update. There are updates from other data sources, which are now kind of catching up to that 2022, Aqua data cut, which suggests we're probably continuing a more or less a linear trend. So if I had to pick a number out of the ether, I'd say we're probably up to 70% use of surveillance now for low risk disease. And I think that probably the steeper rise is going to be in surveillance for the low volume favorable risk, fused gland subtype pattern grade group 2s. But I can also guarantee you there's still a lot of corners of the country and corners of San Francisco where low volume 3.3 is getting overtreated routinely. And focal therapy is probably exacerbating that trend to some extent. So, there's all kinds of pushes and pulls here. But I do think we're continuing to make progress. I think we have a long way to go in the US and as Scott said, in other countries as well. I would emphasize one thing about what are we missing. There is a whole other debate about is MRI good enough, but really important to that debate. We can't forget this. One of the best data sources we have on this is the, at this point, very old PIVOT trial and the PROTECT trial, which, both randomized patients based on what we would today call completely inadequate biopsy, right? 6 cores in the case of Pivot, 10 cores in the case of Protect, non-image guided, done in community centers. In the case of Protect, done largely by residents, right? This was like exhibit A for undersampling. And yet in Pivot, 13 years in, the curves don't even begin to separate between watchful waiting and intervention. So, Protect has clearly shown that a lot of the cancers that are missed are bad. And I think when we get the 20-year paper, we're going to see more and more of an impact of that. But that's at 20 years. At 10 years, at 15 years, first of all, at 10 years, we shouldn't even be screening if that's the horizon, probably not 15 years either. But we need to be a little bit careful about how anxious we are about missing things. We will, and we've had this conversation, the number of men that potentially will die because we don't call it cancer and they don't take surveillance seriously, we will stipulate it's above zero. Mathematically, it's going to be above zero. But the flip side, Scott's talked about the public health argument a lot here. And to me, this all comes back to screening. Because at the end of the day, if we want to save thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of lives from prostate cancer, the answer is we have to screen 90% of men at age 50, not 40%, which is what we do now. And the path to doing that is convincing our colleagues in primary care that we do not have any interest in overdiagnosis. And, that to me, at the end of all this, is sort of the most important underlying current, that if we really want to save lives, we need to screen more. And we've got to convince primary care that we're not going to overdiagnose and therefore not even think about overtreatment.
Well said.
So, Scott, in wrapping it up, we'd love to have an overview of where we think it's going, because we're 3 and a bit years on now from the previous podcast, and I think there definitely has been momentum, and it would be lovely for you to be able to say to us where you'd like to see it going, or what we might see in the future that might help you on this mission to reclassify Gleason 6 prostate cancer.
Yeah, I'm optimistic based on what's happened over the last few years and where we're headed. And I think your explanation of a biopsy-free prostatectomy, to me, is emblematic of something that we all would have mocked at one point that maybe has some legs to it. Mm. And we would have mocked, rechanging the name of a cancer. But as there's, emerging into me and many others, convincing evidence that there's a rationale for it, it starts to make more and more sense. So how that plays out remains to be seen, but there are many grants and projects. There are people having the conversation in prostate and many other cancers. My utopian dream is to do a trial on it where you literally randomize people prior to a diagnostic biopsy to a cancer label versus pick your other term and measure absolutely everything. That would be wonderful if we could pull it off. So we'll see how it plays out. Hopefully we can do these periodically and, report back.
Well, that's good. Lots of conversation, lots of facets to it. And while all this is happening, I think the responsibility still rests on the urologist to communicate this diagnosis to patients appropriately. And these conversations and these podcasts are great because now I always refer to grade group 1 disease as the wimpiest form of cancer. And that's thanks to Scott and Matt, And I think it's important to keep having those discussions with patients and their families. And it might not be one discussion. It might be every time you meet them, but that's important.
And, that's why even though 3.5 years on, and in fact 10, 12, 15 years on from Ian Thompson, all those original people saying this shouldn't even be called cancer, what is happening is it's raising awareness of the fact that grade group 1 cancer without red flags is a low risk cancer. So that conversation itself, I think, is very, very helpful. And these podcasts, they are helpful, even if ultimately the tag is still there. And I think we should still keep up the mission, but there's a lot of positive, consequences from these, quite visible papers and conferences and conversations.
And it's very reassuring to a lot of these patients.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very reassuring to a lot of these patients who'll at least go and ask that question if they've been pushed down. And a lot of the comments on YouTube are about, well, my urologist is still trying to do treatment for me, and people are going to get second opinions and so on. So I think even that is still very, very helpful. But we still wish you very well, Matt and Scott, on the mission of trying to get this cancer renamed, and it still is a worthy mission. Matt, any last comments from you before we wrap it up?
No, I think Scott nailed it.
Well, we'll be seeing Matt soon in Australia, in Sydney for our section meeting. And Scott, next time we see you, hopefully you'll have a nice LA background.
Thanks for engaging on this.
It's great to see you guys.
Yeah, he's going to be swapping out all that winter clothing from Chicago for he's going to turn into one of those California beach bums like Cooperberg
Hollywood
is,
in the
isn't he?
back. Yeah.
Hollywood in the back.
Yeah.
I think that's always been Scott's MO. So.
Great. So that's
Very
all we have
good.
time for on this episode. Thanks so much again to Scott Eggener and Matt Cooperberg for joining us. And apologies to our GU Pathology friends on this Sunday morning that we didn't actually get one of you out of bed or stay up in the evening in the US. But maybe we'll revisit that and we'll revisit that. There's lots of good things to talk about in GU Pathology, so we'll do that. But we'll be back soon with another episode of GU Cast. Thanks very much again to everyone for joining us. Take care.